Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
President Trump has said we'll have to see if the nuclear summit with North Korea is still on next month, following Pyongyang's threat to cancel it if the US continues to push it to disarm. Mr. Trump today said he would continue to insist that North Korea gets rid of its nuclear weapons. From South Korea, Laura Bicker reports.
The historic moment between the leaders of North and South Korea is now so cherished, hundreds are queuing up to recreate it on a fake film set. But hopes for peace are now on hold as this diplomatic drama has taken a more hostile turn. Pyongyang's threatening to withdraw from talks if the US pushes them into a corner of abandoning nuclear weapons. They've partly been angered by this annual military drill dubbed Operation Max Thunder. It involves 100 warplanes, and Pyongyang described it as a deliberate provocation. They also object to the idea they should follow the example of Gaddafi, who voluntarily gave up his weapons 15 years ago. His regime was overthrown and he was killed in 2011. And they take aim at Donald Trump's hawkish advisor.
I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003-2004.
They described him as repugnant. Pyongyang may feel it's making concessions, such as returning the 3 US detainees and getting very little back. They're irritated by the Trump administration's boasts that the president brought Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table. But there is still hope for a deal if the US is willing to listen.
The Korean statement did not say we refuse to denuclearize. It said we're not going to denuclearize if it's you holding a gun to our head. It was there's a way we're willing to do this, and it has to be reciprocal.
The root of the problem is the definition of denuclearisation. To the US, it means North Korea should give up all of its weapons over a set period of time, and then, only then, will it receive economic benefits. To Pyongyang, it means denuclearising the entire peninsula. That means the US has to act too, perhaps getting rid of some troops here in South Korea or getting rid of the nuclear protection it places over the peninsula. Regardless of how far all sides have come in such a short time, the last 24 hours have been a reminder that this decades-old problem will have no quick or easy solution. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Seoul.
Let's talk now to our North America editor, John Sopel in Washington. And John, I suppose the path to this summit was never going to be smooth.
No, it was never going to be smooth, but I kind of was struck really by Donald Trump, who is often so quick to react, so quick to retaliate, has been rather muted in his response today. He stayed off Twitter. He gave some comments to reporters a short time ago saying we haven't heard anything, we don't know anymore. It seems to be the mantra is keep calm and carry on. But he was asked about this question, do you still believe that there has to be denuclearisation of the Korean Peninsula? He said yes. And that could still be the greatest stumbling block to any kind of negotiations taking place in Singapore next month. Now, we heard in Laura's report there about the North Korean attitude towards John Bolton. I thought it was telling this morning that the White House press secretary came out and said, this Libya, the idea that we're following the Libya plan, no, forget that. We don't need to do that. And I thought that kind of put distance between the president and John Bolton. Donald Trump has invested heavily, a lot of political capital into making sure that this summit happens with North Korea. But it can't happen at any cost. He can't just go ahead and say, well, whatever North Korea wants, it can have. So there are still risks, even though the White House might not want it, that this summit could be derailed.
John, thank you. John Sopel there.
Now, North Korea has suspended talks with South Korea and threatened to cancel an historic summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, saying it wasn't interested in a one-sided demand to give up its nuclear weapons. Mr. Trump said he hadn't been notified about any threat and would still insist on North Korea's denuclearization. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris reports.
남조선 당국과 미국은
The newsreader declared that North Korea had changed its mind about talks with South Korea angry at upcoming military exercises between the South and the US that he said repaid North Korea's good intentions with rude and wicked provocation. The exercises happen every year and they always prompt denunciations from Pyongyang, but this year was meant to be different. Remember, way back in April, that historic meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Moon of South Korea in the demilitarized zone that separates their countries, an image that promised to change the world. The follow-through is less photogenic. President Kim cancelling on the next round, the substantive next stage of talks.
북측이 남북 고위급 회담 일자를
The South Koreans called the unilateral decision by the North Koreans regrettable and contrary to the spirit of their joint declaration last month. But the North Koreans weren't finished yet. In a separate statement, Kim Kye-gwan, first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, threatened to call off the June 12th talks between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, not only on account of the exercises, but what he called unbridled, reckless remarks from high-ranking US officials and sinister moves to force it to denuclearize on Washington's terms.
Good morning, Sarah.
Over at the White House, though, they didn't sound too bothered.
Look, this is something that we fully expected. The president is very used and ready for tough negotiations, and if they want to meet, we'll be ready, and if they don't, that's okay too.
Do you expect there to be a meeting,
we'll
Sarah?
continue with the campaign of maximum pressure if that's the case.
According to the Trump handbook and as illustrated by congenial visits by the Secretary of State to Pyongyang, maximum pressure through economic sanctions, taunts and threatening tweets have bowed President Kim and forced him to the table, ready to trade his nuclear arsenal for whatever guarantees and incentives Washington can offer. But Foreign Minister Kim says that's a miscalculation, and if President Trump maintains his course, he'll be recorded as a more tragic and unsuccessful leader even than his predecessors. Oh, and they really don't like John Bolton. In fact, they're furious that the president's national security advisor keeps bringing up the Libyan model for denuclearization like he does on television all the time.
But one thing that Libya did that led us to overcome our skepticism was that they allowed American and British observers into all their nuclear-related sites. So it wasn't a question of relying on international mechanisms. We saw them in ways we had never seen before.
It doesn't take a nuclear scientist to understand why Kim Jong-un isn't comfortable with the Libya comparisons. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee sums it up nicely.
He views having deliverable nuclear weapons as his ticket to dying as an old man in his bed. He saw what happened with Gaddafi. Gaddafi's a dead man now because he gave up his nuclear weapons. And so to think that somebody's going to go in and charm him out of that is not realistic.
But don't worry, says the White House, it's not the Libyan model.
This is the President Trump model. He's going to run this the way he sees fit. We're 100% confident, as we've said many times before, and as we all know that you're aware, he's the best negotiator.
So perhaps it was all part of the negotiation that today, when asked about the North Korean summit, the president couldn't really say what happens next.
We haven't seen anything. We haven't heard anything. We will see what happens. Whatever it is.
So whatever it is. That's the message from President Trump today. Perhaps the other message here is just hold that Nobel Peace Prize for now. To be fair to President Trump, he has been saying all along, look, there is a possibility this summit might not happen if the preconditions for it are not met. There have been some canny moves along the way, certainly. Mike Pompeo's visits to Pyongyang have been judged as fairly successful, and there was that release of 3 American citizens who were held by North Korea. Having said that, though, there's also been an accompanying sense of kind of triumphalism, I think, from the White House, a sense that things are further along, more developed than they actually are when it comes to these talks. And that's what I think we've seen Pyongyang respond to today. They are saying, look, this narrative is incorrect. President Kim is not a weakened leader. We're not coming begging to the table for benefits from you to be paid off for us to give up our nuclear weapons program. President Kim is in a position of strength, and he is the one who will decide whether or not these talks take place.
President Trump's self-proclaimed deal-making skills are clearly going to be put to the test over his planned summit with North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un. He's threatened to call the whole thing off if he alone was expected to abandon his nuclear weapons. This evening, though, President Trump kept up the pressure on North Korea for the summit to go ahead, saying he hadn't seen or heard anything to the contrary.
The battery of reporter questions focused on one issue. Is the president's prized summit with Kim Jong-un now in peril?
We haven't seen anything. We haven't heard anything. We will see what happens. Whatever it is.
Donald Trump suggested he had not been informed of any plan to cancel the Singapore meeting in June.
We'll see what happens. We'll see. Time will tell.
Good morning, Sarah.
Morning, Sarah.
White House advisors said the president would not be intimidated or forced into concessions.
Look, this is something that we fully expected. The president is very used and ready for tough negotiations, and if they want to meet, we'll be ready, and if they don't, that's okay too.
The North Korean statement made clear the country would not be forced into unilateral nuclear disarmament, and it hinted the most anticipated summit in decades is now in doubt. Until this announcement, with a series of masterful and highly symbolic diplomatic steps, Kim Jong-un had raised expectations of a dramatic breakthrough. That border summit with the South Korean leader last month, and his meetings with the US Secretary of State, were all part of Pyongyang's unexpected charm offensive. So too was the decision to release the 3 Americans being detained, a move that led Trump to praise the North Korean dictator. But US national security experts say Kim was never likely to agree to simply abandon the country's missile program or dismantle his precious nuclear arsenal without major concessions in return.
Kim Jong-un has real priorities, and those are regime security, and nuclear weapons are a real part of that, or have been a part of that for decades. So the fact that he would simply show up in Singapore and say, here are my nuclear weapons, with getting nothing back, that simply wasn't a realistic outcome.
As experts puzzle over Kim's precise strategy, John Bolton, one of the most hawkish figures in the administration, made a link with a previous nuclear deal that may have alerted Kim to the prospect of an American trap.
I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003-2004.
For Kim Jong-un, Libya and the fate of Colonel Gaddafi at the hands of an angry mob may be the best example of why not to surrender his nuclear weapons. The deal Gaddafi made did not save him. Joint US-South Korean military exercises will still go ahead as planned. For Seoul and for Washington, this is now a time for calibration, trying to show military strength and diplomatic resolve, but without blowing up the prospects for the summit. President Trump seemed unusually defensive in the Oval Office, suddenly aware that the summit he has so trumpeted may elude him after all.
Back to Robert Moore in Washington in just a moment, but first to Debbie Edward in Beijing. Debbie, what's behind Kim Jong-un's tactics here, and will Beijing put pressure on him to go ahead with the summit?
Well, this is a power play from Kim Jong-un. He's entering these talks with Donald Trump, viewing himself as an equal to the President of the United States. And as far as North Korea is concerned, they have been making all the goodwill gestures so far. They have signed that peace declaration with the South. There is evidence to suggest they've started dismantling their nuclear test site. And then we saw that release of those 3 American detainees last week. So this is a warning to President Trump that Kim Jong-un is not going to get around that summit table in Singapore without something in return. He's not going to give up his nuclear weapons with just the offer of economic support. They want a specific concession on sanctions, for example. The government here in Beijing will be urging Kim Jong-un to make it nothing more than a warning shot and to go through with that summit, because they are only too aware that if diplomacy fails on this occasion, President Trump has his military primed and ready to take things down a very different and dangerous path.
Debbie, thank you. And Robert, the President has committed a lot of political capital to this summit, even talk of the Nobel Peace Prize. How does he end up looking if it doesn't happen now?
Well, Trump's critics have often pointed out that what's unfolded over the last 24 hours is entirely predictable. I mean, as Debbie was alluding to there, you know, there is almost no likelihood that Kim Jong-un is about to hand over his nuclear arsenal, his strategic crown jewels, his passport to regime survival. I think the problem for the president is bigger than that, though. It's, has he really understood and drilled down on the intricacies and the complexities and the long game that is a nuclear arms agreement? So the question isn't just will Singapore happen, but rather if it does happen in 27 days' time, is the president fully prepared for it? There is, of course, also the bigger parallel issue. This president has just walked away. He's just, frankly, violated the Iran nuclear deal. If the diplomatic opportunity, if the breakthrough that is represented by North Korea evaporates, then he, the United States, the world is looking at not one, but two nuclear crises coming down the track.
Robert Moore, thank you.
All politics, they say, is personal, and the North Korean leadership has just illustrated the point rather keenly. Kim Jong-un has warned they're now reconsidering their meeting with President Trump next month and pointed the finger in no unwavering terms at Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton. In a statement, they took aim at Mr. Bolton, known for his hardline stance on foreign policy, and admitted they couldn't hide their feeling of repugnance towards him. At the heart of this fallout lies Trump's insistence that the Korean peninsula must denuclearize. Tonight, the US president has stayed uncharacteristically quiet, no furious tweets, but an admission he will have to wait and see what happens next. So is the foreign policy coup of the year still going ahead? And what will those two larger-than-life characters do next? Here's John Sweeney.
This is a graphic novel like no other. Back in the day in Gotham City, there arose from the wrong side of the tracks a superhero who became the most powerful man on earth, the Trumpster. He had lots of enemies, but the most feared of all was Rocket Man. His nuclear bombs got bigger, his missiles kept on getting closer and closer to the mainland USA. Last year, the Trumpster hit out.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
But Rocket Man wasn't backing down, telling the Trumpster, rather than frightening or stopping me, that the path I chose is correct, and that is the one I have to follow to the last. The Trumpster retaliated, sick puppy, obviously a madman. Rocket Man fired back that the Trumpster was a mentally deranged US dotard. Suddenly this year, hopes for peace started to grow. Rocket Man met his counterpart on the Korean peninsula from across the DMZ. There was talk of a powwow between the two superheroes. Now, Rocket Man doesn't want to give up his nukes or his rockets. Tonight, the Trumpster risks looking like he's been played for a fool. The driver for North Korea's change of direction were comments made by Trump's box-fresh national security advisor, John Bolton.
I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003-2004. We're also looking at what North Korea itself has committed to previously.
What Bolton didn't spell out was how the Libyan model ended up for its ruler. But the North Koreans are all too well aware of Gaddafi's end. In an angry statement, North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister said it is absolutely absurd to dare compare the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a nuclear weapons state, to Libya. On Mr. Bolton, he did not hold back. We do not hide our feelings of repugnance towards him.
John Bolton was being the opposite of diplomatic. He wasn't trying to be diplomatic. He was trying to ensure that the summit would fail.
As you'd expect from the world's most totalitarian state, the North Koreans are much better at message discipline. But they have conflicting policy goals too.
I think it's really hard to predict these things. But I do think that there are some big benefits in getting rid of nuclear weapons for North Korea. There'll be sanctions being lifted. There'll be a new relationship with the United States. There'll be a new relationship with South Korea. It'll be much easier for China. There are some big wins for them if they can pull it off.
War in the next 6 months is probably in the area of 25%. I still think there's a probability that the summit will get back on track. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, wants it to. President Trump wants it to. Bolton, I don't think, does. So probably it'll get back on track, but we're in a dangerous situation.
Michael D'Antonio has written a biography of Donald Trump.
I think Donald Trump's view of the world was formed in the 1950s during his childhood and shaped in many ways by comic books and superheroes. In his mind, he is the primary character moving world history. So Kim would be Rocket Man, the president would consider himself to be a kind of Superman, and in a way this dynamic may work out for both of them.
There's some black comedy in the clash between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, two characters who could have been drawn for each other. But the ending could get so much darker.
Well, that was John Sweeney. We were hoping to be joined by a guest with insight in the Trump campaign in Washington tonight. Technology there has let us down, but we can speak to Balbina Huang. She served as a senior advisor to US Ambassador Christopher Hill during his negotiations with North Korea, and she joins us from Seoul. Balbina Huang, great to have you on Newsnight. Just take us, if you can, inside the North Korean mindset now. What do you think has provoked this?
Well, I don't think it's even really a provocation. I think this is quite a clear and actually a very calculated statement. We should understand that, first of all, this was a series of statements that came out this morning. KCNA, the official spokesperson for the North Korean government, first came out and stated that it was going to cancel the first of a meetings scheduled with the South Korean government. Now, this was in reaction to joint exercises being staged between the United States and South Korea. These were scheduled in advance, and this was something that North Korea had not objected to, in fact, had agreed would accept as part of the recent inter-Korean agreement. This was clearly meant to provoke South Korea and to sort of upset what President Moon had clearly been riding on as a wave of popular optimism in South Korea. And again, meant to sort of try to destabilize, I think, South Korean public. It was then quickly followed by a statement from Foreign Minister Kim Gae-kwan. Now, it's important to understand this is a gentleman who has been involved for the last several decades in directly negotiating with the last previous 4 presidents of the United States regarding specifically the nuclear programs. And so this is a man, by the way, in the foreign ministry, which is the diplomatic corps of the North Korean government. He is not the man that is going to meet President Trump or scheduled to meet President Trump. And he's the man that was directly involved with John Bolton during the President Bush years. Remember, this is President Bush, and this is John Bolton of the neocons. And this is this is the axis of evil.
Right, so they bear a grudge, presumably, towards John Bolton. We know that from the statement. Is your sense that President Trump overplayed his hand here?
Well, no, I don't think so. And I think it's important to understand that President Trump is one of the most unusual presidents that the world has ever seen in the United States. When we say the Trump administration, there really is no Trump administration. President Trump is a lone wolf in the sense that he is now acting alone. And I think there is an administration. It's actually more disciplined now. This is the Trump administration 2.0. Pompeo, Bolton, these are now a little bit more disciplined than the previous. But President Trump is much more comfortable acting alone. And I think we just saw that, 2 days ago, when it seems in the last month.
Balbina, I'm just going to bring in Scotty Nell Hughes, who's a Conservative commentator who can join us on this exact point now. Do you feel, Scotty, that John Bolton has knocked this off course a little bit for Donald Trump? Do you think that was deliberate or a mistake?
Well, whether it's deliberate or a mistake, it has happened. But I think this is just a normal reaction that we've seen North Korea do before. This is a part of the playbook. They did it back in 1994 before their talks then. This is just to try to get them to gain leverage in the talks going into the June 12th summit.
But does it make you think, well, actually, they're not going to denuclearize? You know, when he's talking about Libya, they saw what happened to Gaddafi. That's not going to be a very tempting offer for somebody who's thinking about negotiating with your president.
Well, I think this is North Korea making much ado about nothing, trying to gain the leverage because they knew about these types of the routines and the practices that we were going to be going into ahead of time. And all of a sudden, they're making this big deal of it. I do think we're going to see continuing. But then again, we are dealing with Kim Jong-un. And as your previous guest just stated, this is Donald Trump, President Trump. And so you can never actually expect the traditional things to be happening. But I don't think this knocks it typically off course. I think this is just a part of the North Korean playbook that they've done in the past. And the talks will continue.
Balbina Huang, would you put money on this going ahead in June, the June 12th summit?
Well, yes and no. Look, it's not necessarily much ado about nothing. This is actually a lot more sophisticated than that. North Korea is making very clear that the Libya model itself is off the table. That doesn't mean necessarily that denuclearization itself isn't. And I think what North Korea is making clear is they're willing to deal with President Trump. And I think President Trump, again, is separate from Bolton. Now, Bolton has a very specific idea about processes, about CVID, but President Trump, I think, would be happy with, for example, just taking, 5 nuclear bombs, loading them on Air Force One, and saying, here, I got denuclearization.
So,
that's very different.
Scotty Nell Hughes, was this John Bolton speaking to Donald Trump through the television, if you like, and saying, hang on, don't go too soft here. We have to have a pretty hardline approach, whether President Trump agrees with that or not?
Well, this is how John Bolton usually is. He does take a hardline approach to things. But truth of all it is, just like North Korea has done this in the past before, and they have a history of trying to gain leverage by doing tactics like this and maneuvers like this, this is exactly what President Trump and his administration is. You can't count on anything. And I agree, not necessarily much ado about nothing, but once again, this is all what you would expect going into the chaos. And just having these talks in this summit on June 12th shows a bigger advance than we've had with any of the past administrations.
But you know that people are saying this is about bragging rights, and actually Donald Trump probably overplayed his hand. He went a little bit too confident into this, and North Korea is coming out on top at the moment.
Either way, we've gotten a lot farther with President Trump than we have the past few administrations. So he already has the upper hand in the bragging moments that he has. But it's not about bragging right now. It's about true making people safe on the Korean Peninsula, as well as stabilizing the area for the rest of the international marketplace. So I think right now, it's not necessarily about bragging rights. It's about actually getting to the table on June 12th. And when both are trying to show who's the bigger person, what John Bolton did today, I think, was actually just another move to show North Korea we are the ones that actually have the bigger power right now.
It's really great to have had you both. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.